I still remember the way the words sliced through the air as if they belonged to a stranger. We were in my own kitchen, the one with the scuffed linoleum and the smell of cinnamon buns I had just pulled from the oven. Lisa wouldn't look at me, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her coffee cup, but Douglas stared straight at me as if daring me to protest. "Mom, we don't need you anymore. Move out," he said in that flat tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable while being cruel. My heart did not stop like they say in stories, but it sank like a stone into a cold lake, and I felt the chair's wooden edge dig into my palms. Before I continue, please take a moment to subscribe so that you'll be the first to listen to these new stories as I post them here on the channel. Then click the like button to show other moms with adult kids that we're all in this together. Andy, my 6-year-old grandson, was coloring at the table, humming off key, his little fingers smudged with marker, unaware that the world was about to crack. He looked up briefly when Douglas spoke and then back down, because children can sense tension, but not always understand it. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly, each second like a mocking metronome counting down the seconds until my life as I knew it would end. I had spent decades cooking in that kitchen, paying the mortgage, refinishing the cabinets, and patching the roof when storms blew in from the Atlantic. My husband, God rest him, and I had built a room onto the back of the house so Lisa could have her own bedroom when she outgrew her crib. I had let them move back in when they fell on hard times 6 years ago, promising them the stability they said they needed as new parents. Now, at 76, with my hips aching on rainy days and my eyesight not what it once was, I was being told to gather my things and leave. I could feel an anger begin to bubble beneath my shock, not a wild rage, but a steady heat, like a kettle left on a low flame. There is a particular cruelty in being discarded by your own blood after you have given them everything, and that cruelty burns a slow, clean fire. But even as the sting of betrayal seared me, another part of me went cold and steady because I knew something they didn't know. The deed to this house still had my name printed first, and there were rights that came with that ink they had either forgotten or ignored. Lisa had never been one for details, always more concerned with how things appeared than how they were owned, and Douglas had assumed control without reading the fine print. That assumption was their first mistake, and the second was thinking that the woman who had survived winters without heat and raised a child alone would simply be told to leave and obey. I took a breath, inhaling the scent of coffee and cinnamon and betrayal, and I said nothing because silence would be my first weapon. Not responding created a strange vacuum in the kitchen, a space that unsettled Douglas more than if I had shouted back. He cleared his throat and said something about how they needed my room for a home office, that remote work was their future, and that I could always find a place in town. Lisa nodded without looking up, and my stomach flipped when I saw her do that little half shrug she used to do as a teenager when she was embarrassed by me. I wondered briefly if she remembered the nights I sat by her bed when she had nightmares, whispering stories to coax her back to sleep. I wondered if she realized how ridiculous it was to tell someone to leave when the smell of her perfume still lingered from hugging me good morning. My mind went back to the conversation I had overheard a week earlier when she thought I was in the garden and she was whispering to Douglas on the porch. She had said, "Mom will understand. We've done so much for her." And he had laughed and said, "She's old. She'll go quietly." I had stood outside the open window, hands buried in potting soil, listening to my own child plan to put me out like unwanted furniture. The smell of damp earth and basil had grounded me then, reminding me that I was still rooted here, even if they thought they could uproot me. Now, with their ultimatum laid bare, I saw the path I would take forming in the back of my mind, a path lined with county clerk offices, bank visits, and quiet revenge. I looked over at Andy and forced a smile so I wouldn't scare him, and he smiled back with a gap-toothed grin that made my heart ache. He started to hold up his drawing, proud of the messy rainbow he'd made, but Douglas shot him a look, and he lowered it, confusion flickering across his small face. That's when it hit me how deeply their manipulation ran. They were willing to deny that sweet boy's need to share his joy if it might soften me. They would use his presence as a lever, as they always did, letting me see him only when I was compliant, threatening to take him away when I asserted myself. That tactic had worked on me before, because I love that child like he is my own heartbeat. But the threat was losing its power now that I saw their full intent. Once you realize someone will hurt you anyway, fear has less grip. The cold open of this story wasn't the day of the ultimatum. It was the look in Andy's eyes when he realized something bad was happening, and I vowed that day to fight not just for myself, but for him. I said, all right, because sometimes the most strategic move is to appear to agree, and because I needed them calm while I gathered what I needed. Douglas looked relieved, which told me he had expected a fight. He didn't know me as well as he thought. Lisa murmured, "Thank you, Mom," as if she were doing me a favor by letting me comply with her demand. I asked how soon they were thinking, and she said they wanted the room by the end of next month, which gave me just over 4 weeks to put my plan in motion. 4 weeks may not sound like much, but for a woman like me who had raised a child on a single paycheck and had to stretch every minute and every dollar, 4 weeks was a lifetime. I tucked away the timeline like a note pinned on a corkboard, and I nodded and said I needed to clear out my things in the attic first. They both nodded, oblivious to the fact that the attic contained not just my quilts and holiday decorations, but also the file boxes with our purchase documents. After breakfast, I excused myself and climbed the creaky stairs, my knees protesting with each step, but my mind sharp and focused. The attic smelled of cedar and dust, and afternoon light filtered through the single window, turning dust motes into floating stars. I sat cross-legged on the floor and pulled out the box labeled House Papers, the one I had insisted on keeping when we refinanced 3 years ago. Inside were folders, the warranty deed, the mortgage statements, the life estate agreement we had drawn up at the kitchen table with a notary from the bank. My fingers traced the raised seal of the county clerk, the same clerk who had congratulated me with a smile when we filed the documents at the courthouse. I read the words again to steady myself. Grantor retains a life estate in said property with right of possession and profits until death or voluntary relinquishment. That sentence meant I had the legal right to live in this house until I died or chose otherwise, regardless of what Lisa or Douglas wanted. I also saw the second clause, one that Douglas had insisted was fair at the time. If any party wished to sell, the other parties had 30 days to match any bona fide offer. He had assumed that clause protected them from my doing anything rash, but he had not considered that I knew every realtor in town and every clause in the state code. One thing about being 76 is that you have watched enough unscrupulous contractors, lenders, and even relatives try to get the better of you, so you learn to read everything twice. I set the papers aside and then opened a small journal where I recorded my to-do lists in tidy handwriting, a habit from decades of secretarial work. Under Monday, I wrote, "Call county clerk to verify deed recording, schedule appointment with elder law attorney, check bank account balances." I had a small account at the local credit union, but I knew I needed to open a separate account to handle any proceeds from the sale without them seeing a penny. A friend from church had once mentioned that Chase had good fraud alerts and that their branch manager treated seniors with respect. I made a mental note to visit the Chase branch near the Safeway after lunch, disguised as a grocery run. I also jotted down "Call Mary" because Mary was my neighbor 2 houses down, widowed like me, who had once sued her brother for refusing to sell their inherited cottage. She had told me over tea that partition actions were messy, but sometimes necessary when family refused to be fair. At the time, I had nodded politely, not imagining I'd need that information for my own daughter. I lifted the lid on the trunk next to the boxes and pulled out my husband's old recorder, a bulky little thing with tape still in it from when he had recorded our grandson's first words. I smiled at the memory, then checked the battery compartment and was surprised when the battery still had life. Technology had marched forward, but this simple device had one advantage. No one thought to look for a cassette recorder these days. In Maine, you only need one party's consent to record a conversation unless you're in a private place like a bathroom, so I wasn't breaking the law by hitting record on my own kitchen table. I decided then and there that the next time Douglas and Lisa talked with me about the house, I'd let the recorder run beneath a stack of magazines. I didn't plan on broadcasting it, but I wanted evidence of the way they spoke to me in case they tried to paint me as unstable or delusional. My sister had once been locked out of her own bank account because her son told the teller she was experiencing dementia, and she had no proof she was of sound mind at the time. I wasn't about to let that happen to me. The next morning, I drove my old Toyota Camry down to the bank, the engine humming reliably despite its years, the tires crunching on gravel. At the branch, a young man held the door for me and smiled, and the cool air-conditioned lobby was a relief from the humid August heat. A woman named Karen greeted me at the teller line and asked what she could do for me, and I told her I wanted to open a new checking account. She guided me to her desk, offered me a bottle of water, and asked if I had any questions about account types. I told her I needed something simple with online access but no joint holders, and she nodded and explained the difference between regular and senior accounts. I chose the one with no monthly fee if you kept a minimum balance, and she filled out the paperwork swiftly, her fingers flying over the keyboard. When she asked for my identification, I slid over my Maine driver's license, which I had renewed last month, and she entered my information. I felt a pang at listing my daughter as my nearest relative, but I left it blank because this account was not for her to know about. Karen mentioned that large check deposits might be subject to a hold of 2 to 7 business days under federal regulation, especially for new accounts, and I nodded, making a note to factor that into my timeline. She asked if I'd like paper statements or digital, and I opted for paper because I didn't want any emails popping up on the home computer they still had access to. Leaving the bank with my new account and a folder of brochures, I felt a small sense of victory. It was the first tangible step toward reclaiming my dignity. Next, I drove to the county clerk's office, the same courthouse where Lisa had gotten her marriage license and where I had filed our life estate. The clerk recognized me and smiled, and when I asked for a certified copy of our deed, she pulled it up without hesitation. "You know, you have the right to remain in that house until you pass or decide otherwise," she said quietly, glancing at me over her readers. I nodded and said I was just making sure our records were in order, and she stamped the copy with a date that glowed like a promise. I slid the document into my purse and felt its weight like a shield. On my way home, I stopped at a CVS to pick up some pain relief gel for my arthritic knee, and the pharmacist complimented me on my floral blouse. As I waited for my prescription, I caught my reflection in the convex mirror by the blood pressure machine, and I saw a woman with white hair pulled back, eyes clear, mouth set. I looked like my grandmother when she took on the paper mill that had polluted our town's river, and I drew strength from that memory. When I got home, Lisa was in the living room on a video call, her headset on, and she barely glanced at me. Douglas was in the den, ordering something on his laptop, and I recognized the blue and orange website of a home improvement store from the corner of my eye. He was probably buying lumber to build that home office desk that would occupy the room he planned to evict me from. I went to my room and closed the door, and the scent of lavender detergent on my sheets calmed me for a moment. Then I took out my phone, dialed Mary's number, and listened as her line rang. "Hi, Mary, it's Sam," I said when she answered, and there was a rustle like she was wiping her hands on a dish towel. "I was just about to make coffee," she said. "Do you want to come over and talk?" There are friends you gossip with and friends you call when your world is falling apart. Mary was the latter. I told her I'd be right over, and I tucked the recorder into my purse on instinct. The sun was high and the asphalt radiated heat as I walked the short distance to her house, my sandals slapping softly. Her kitchen smelled of coffee and lemon and comfort, and she pulled me into a hug as soon as she saw my face. We sat at her table, the same one where we had played cards during the blackouts last winter, and I told her what Lisa and Douglas had said. Mary's eyes widened, and she muttered something under her breath that would have made her pastor blush. "You have rights," she said when she composed herself, and she recounted her own fight with her brother over their parents' camp. She explained that in our state, if co-owners couldn't agree, the courts could order a partition, sometimes splitting the property physically, other times ordering a sale and dividing the proceeds. She warned that the process wasn't quick, but it was fair, and it required filing at the county court and serving notice to all owners. I asked about the timeline, and she said her case had taken about 4 months from filing to court order, which would be cutting it close, but was still within my time frame. She also mentioned that sometimes just the threat of a partition action brought the other side to the table. As she spoke, I thought about Douglas's arrogance and how he believed he could talk his way out of anything. He had once negotiated a discount on a car at the dealership by intimidating the salesman, but he couldn't intimidate a judge. "Do you have a lawyer?" she asked, and I shook my head. "You need one who understands elder law and real estate," she said, scribbling a name and number on the back of a grocery list. The name on the slip was Jonathan Pierce, Esquire, and she said he had helped her with her partition action. I tucked the number into my wallet and promised to call as soon as I got home. When I stepped back outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the salty smell of the ocean, and I felt steadier than I had in days. Back at the house, I found Andy on the front porch, sitting on the steps with a juice box, his sneakers tapping a rhythm on the wood. He looked up and said, "Nana, will you still come to my soccer game on Saturday?" With that earnest tone that could melt ice. I crouched down despite the protest from my knees and said, "I will always come to your games, sweetheart, no matter where I live." His small arms wrapped around my neck, and for a moment the world shrank to that embrace. Douglas stuck his head out the front door and said, "Andy, come inside. We need to talk about your homework." And Andy pulled away reluctantly. I watched him go and felt a renewed resolve. This house had hosted his first steps, and now it would host a reckoning. The next day I called Jonathan Pierce from my room. The door closed so my voice wouldn't carry. He answered on the second ring, and I told him briefly what was happening, my voice steady despite the tremor in my heart. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he asked if I still had the documents we had filed when we created the life estate. I said yes and offered to bring them to his office, and he scheduled an appointment for Thursday at 10 a.m., reminding me to bring any correspondence I'd received from Lisa or Douglas. He also told me that state courts could order a sale in cases where property couldn't be partitioned without injury to the owners, citing the statute number. I scribbled the statute number down even though I wasn't planning to represent myself. Knowledge was still power. Before hanging up, he asked if I felt safe in the house, and I said yes because for now the danger was emotional, not physical. He advised me to avoid confrontation and to document everything, including any threats or manipulations, and I assured him I was already doing just that. After the call, I went to the kitchen and began to bake, because kneading dough and measuring sugar had always been my way of processing anger. As I sifted flour into the old mixing bowl, I thought about the early years after my husband died, when Lisa and I clung to each other like survivors clinging to driftwood. I remembered the first time I took Andy to the pediatrician by myself because Lisa had postpartum depression and Douglas had to work, and how I'd sat with that baby on my lap under the harsh fluorescent lights of the urgent care clinic. Those memories were threads that tethered me to the love I still felt for my daughter, even as she hurt me now. Tethered or not, I wasn't going to let that love be used as a weapon against my dignity again. On Thursday morning, I dressed in my navy skirt and pressed blouse, the same outfit I'd worn to church on Easter, because I wanted to look put together for the lawyer. I stopped by a bakery cafe to buy a coffee and a cinnamon roll, partly out of habit and partly to steady my nerves, the smell of baked bread calming me. The waiting area in Jonathan Pierce's office had a potted plant, a stack of magazines, and a receptionist who greeted me by name as if I were family. Jonathan was in his mid-40s, with kind eyes and a firm handshake, and he gestured me to a chair across from his desk, covered in neat stacks of files. He flipped through my documents, murmuring, and stopped at the life estate clause, nodding appreciatively. "This gives you control," he said, tapping the paper, and then he explained how a partition action might unfold. He told me that if I wanted to sell, I could list my life interest, but no buyer would pay much because they'd only have rights until my death. The smarter move, he said, was to force a sale of the whole property. He explained that we'd file in the Superior Court, and the judge would likely order an equitable partition, meaning a sale and division of proceeds. Because I had paid more toward the mortgage and maintenance, I could argue for a larger share of the proceeds. He also reminded me that a court process could take several months, and I told him about the 30-day clause requiring the others to match an offer. He leaned back, thought for a moment, and then smiled slightly, saying that clause could be our lever. If I found a serious buyer and they couldn't match within 30 days, they'd have to go along with the sale or buy me out. I left his office with a clear plan and a folder of legal forms to sign, my signature neat and determined at the bottom of each page. On the way back, I stopped at Costco to pick up a pack of paper towels and some fresh salmon because the house still needed to be stocked, and I wasn't about to let them say I shirked my duties. As I pushed my cart past the electronics aisle, I glanced at a display of security systems and thought briefly about how ironic it would be to buy something to keep my own family out. That thought made me laugh softly and startled a woman loading cases of sparkling water into her cart. She smiled back and said nothing. Back home, I unloaded the groceries and slid the salmon into the freezer, my movements steady and purposeful. I noticed Lisa watching me from the doorway, and I could feel the tension like an extra layer of humidity in the house. She cleared her throat and asked if I'd be making dinner, as if nothing had happened. I said yes because the plan required normalcy. Any sign of rebellion would trigger their suspicion. While peeling carrots and chopping onions, I turned over the timeline in my head like prayer beads. I had about 3 weeks until they expected me gone, but the real estate market moved slowly. I needed a buyer quickly, someone who'd jump at a fair price and be willing to close within 30 days. My cousin Carol lived in Boston and had once mentioned wanting a second home on the coast, so I sent her a text. I wrote, "Thinking of selling the house. Would you or anyone you know be interested?" and pressed send before I could second guess. She responded within an hour. "We might be. Call me tonight." And my pulse quickened at the possibility. That evening, after Lisa and Douglas retreated to their room and Andy was asleep, I sat in my car in the driveway and called Carol. She answered on the first ring, and the sound of traffic in the background told me she was on her way home from work. I explained my situation, leaving out the part about my daughter telling me to move out, and focused on the opportunity. Carol had always admired our house. Its wraparound porch and view of the marsh were rare, and property values had risen. She asked me the price, and I told her I'd get a market appraisal, but I was thinking of listing below market to ensure a quick sale. She said she'd talk to her partner and get back to me, and I felt a sliver of hope. The next morning, I called a real estate agent I've known for 20 years, Deborah, who has sold half the homes in our town. She answered with her usual cheer, and when I told her I wanted a discreet appraisal, she didn't ask why. "I'll swing by Thursday," she said, lowering her voice as if we were conspiring, which in a way we were. While waiting for Deborah's visit, I busied myself with my usual routines to avoid alerting Lisa or Douglas. In the afternoons, I would take Andy to his soccer practices, sitting on the bleachers with other grandparents, clapping as he chased the ball. It was there that I felt a tug of guilt because the home I was planning to sell was the home he thought he'd grow up in. But every time that guilt flared, it met the equal and opposite force of remembering Douglas's dead-eyed statement, "Mom, we don't need you anymore," echoed in my mind like the hum of the scoreboard clock. Deborah arrived on Thursday with her measuring wheel, clipboard, and a quick smile. We walked through the house while Lisa was at work and Douglas was running errands. She admired the crown molding we had installed years ago, noted the aging appliances, and jotted numbers in her ledger. "What are we looking at, Deb?" I asked as casually as I could. She estimated the house could fetch around $485,000 if I listed it normally. "If we priced it at $440 to move quickly," she said, "there would be multiple offers." I did the math in my head, thinking about the mortgage balance, which was down to $210, most of it paid by me. Even after closing costs, I'd walk away with more than enough to rent a small place and sock away some savings. "Can you keep this between us?" I asked, and she nodded solemnly, understanding the stakes. We scheduled a photographer for Saturday morning at 8, before anyone else would wake up. I spent Friday evening decluttering the living room, hiding personal photos, and dusting shelves with a microfiber cloth until everything gleamed. As I slid our family photo album into a box, a snapshot fell out. Me holding baby Lisa on this very porch, both of us laughing. I pressed it to my chest and then slipped it into my journal. Memory would fuel me, not chain me. Saturday dawned misty and cool, typical of early September, with fog rolling in from the river. The photographer was a young woman with tattoos, and she moved quickly, snapping wide-angle shots of the kitchen and the porch. I made sure to open the windows to let in light and to hide the pile of mail with Lisa's name on it. By 9:30, she was gone, and the house looked untouched when Lisa and Douglas came downstairs yawning. They mentioned going to a big box store to get supplies for the new office, and I nodded as if that didn't sting. While they were gone, I sat at the kitchen table and drafted a handwritten list of everything I'd need to pack. Each item I wrote, quilts, photo albums, tax returns, made the situation more real and yet also more manageable. I didn't tell them about the open house Deborah planned for Sunday because there wouldn't be one. We were doing private showings only. That evening, Carol called back and said she and her partner wanted to come up and see the house next weekend. My heart fluttered, and I told her I looked forward to it, keeping my voice level. I now had a prospective buyer who I trusted and who could move quickly if need be. But I also knew that if Carol balked, there would be other interested parties because Deborah's eyes had lit up when she mentioned her list of clients. By Sunday afternoon, I had cleaned the house top to bottom, my body aching but my spirit steady. I took a break in the backyard, sitting on the swing my husband had hung from the old maple tree. The rope creaked as I rocked, and I let my eyes drift over the vegetable garden, the raised beds I had built with Douglas when we still got along. We had once laughed out here while planting tomatoes, our hands dirty, Andy toddling nearby, and those days felt like a different life. The open loop that kept me going was the question of how they'd react when the for sale sign appeared. Would they beg, threaten, or pretend to be victims? As I swung, I also thought about the B story of my plan, finances and logistics. I had moved most of my savings into the new account and left just enough in our joint account to cover utilities until the sale. The joint account would be closed on closing day. I would not leave them a dime of proceeds because I had paid for more than 50% of everything. I had also made an appointment at the Social Security office to update my address, something I'd need to do once I moved. In the C story, Mary continued to check in on me daily, bringing over Tupperware of soup and reminding me to take care of myself. She told me that her daughter, a nurse at the local hospital, had been through something similar with her own mother-in-law, and that I was brave. Those calls were like little lifelines, pulling me through moments when fear threatened to drown me. On Tuesday afternoon, I heard the delivery truck rumble up and deliver a box with Douglas's name on it. He opened it at the table and pulled out a brand new computer, probably for the new office he wanted to build, and I bit my tongue. Meanwhile, the online listing for our house went live with a price of $439,900, which was low enough to raise eyebrows. Deborah texted me 2 hours later, already have 3 interested, can show Wednesday at 10 and 1. You good? I replied yes and plotted how to get Lisa and Douglas out of the house for those times. It turned out I didn't need to manipulate. Douglas had an appointment at the car dealership for a routine service on their vehicle, and Lisa had a dentist appointment in town. On Wednesday morning after they left, I opened all the curtains, baked a batch of cookies to make the house smell inviting, and waited. The first couple was a young family with 2 kids. The little girl ran straight to Andy's toys, and my chest tightened. The father commented on the spacious kitchen, and the mother asked about the school district. I answered truthfully, pointing out the benefits without overselling, because I didn't want to come across as desperate. The second interested party was a retired couple from another state, looking to downsize and move closer to their grandchildren. They loved the porch and the fact that the master bedroom was on the first floor, and they asked if I was the owner. I said yes, that my daughter and son-in-law lived with me, but would be moving out soon, and I tried not to let my voice crack. Both parties expressed interest, but needed to check finances, and Deborah promised to follow up. When Lisa and Douglas returned that afternoon, they didn't notice anything different except maybe the lingering smell of cookies. The next day, we got an offer. The retired couple offered $435,000 with a 25% cash down payment and a 30-day closing window. Deborah forwarded the email to me, and my heart pounded as I read it because the numbers lined up perfectly with the clause in our agreement. If Lisa and Douglas couldn't match it within 30 days, they'd have to go along with the sale. I forwarded the offer to Jonathan, who replied with, "Excellent. We need to serve them with notice and start the clock." That evening I sat at the dinner table across from Lisa and Douglas, my recorder tucked under the runner, and I cleared my throat. "I have something to discuss with you," I said, and their heads snapped up like deer hearing a twig break. My voice was calm, but my heart pounded like a drum, and I could feel the texture of the linen under my fingers anchoring me. "I've received an offer on the house for $435,000, I said, sliding the printout of the offer across the table. Douglas's eyebrows shot up, and Lisa's mouth fell open as if I had announced I was moving to Mars. "You can't sell the house," Lisa said, her voice rising. "We live here." "Actually, legally, I can," I replied, pointing to the clause in our agreement. "You have 30 days to match this offer or agree to the sale. That's what you insisted on when we drew up the documents." Douglas snatched the paper, scanned it, and then looked at me with a mix of disbelief and anger. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You're being vindictive." "I'm being fair," I said. "You told me you didn't need me. I don't need this house. It's time we all moved on." They sputtered, alternating between pleading and threatening, and I kept my voice level, reminding them that I had paid most of the mortgage. "We can get a loan and match it," Douglas said at one point, but I knew their debt would make that impossible. I didn't say that. I let the thought hang in the air between us like humidity, heavy and oppressive. They asked about Andy, about where he would go to school, about his room, and I said calmly that children are adaptable and that they'd have time to find a place. Lisa started to cry, saying I was breaking up the family, and I felt the old urge to comfort her, but I did not reach across the table. Instead, I said, "After everything I gave you, you told me I was no longer needed. This is what happens when you forget where you came from." I saw something flicker in her eyes, shame or maybe understanding, but Douglas's face hardened. "We'll take this to court," he snapped, and I said quietly, "Then I'll see you there." He stormed out, slamming the back door so hard the framed cross-stitch of the Serenity Prayer rattled against the wall. Lisa followed him, and I sat there alone for a moment, the ticking clock louder than my thoughts. I reached under the runner and clicked off the recorder, glad I had captured his threats and my calm responses. It occurred to me then that the C story, my relationship with Andy, was about to get complicated. I didn't know if they'd withhold him from me, and the thought made my throat close up. Later that night, Andy knocked on my bedroom door and crawled into my bed like he used to when he was younger. "Mom and Dad are mad," he whispered. "Are you mad too?" I wrapped my arm around him and whispered back, "I'm sad, but I'm not mad at you, and I never will be." He nodded in the dark and fell asleep, his small hand clutching my nightgown, and I lay awake staring at the ceiling, counting the days until closing. The next morning, Douglas and Lisa left early, leaving Andy in my care as usual, and I fixed him pancakes extra fluffy the way he liked. At 9, there was a knock at the door, and when I opened it, a man in khakis and a polo shirt introduced himself as a process server. He handed me a thick envelope addressed to Lisa and Douglas, and I signed for it, my hand steady. Jonathan had filed the partition action along with the buyer's offer, and the summons required them to appear in court in 3 weeks if they intended to contest the sale. I left the envelope on the hall table and went about my day, not wanting to be the one to hand them their own consequences. When they returned that evening, Douglas saw the envelope, ripped it open, and his face turned a shade I hadn't seen before. "What is this?" he demanded, waving the summons like a flag, and I said, "It's the process you said you'd use. Now we all will." They argued late into the night behind their closed bedroom door, their voices muffled, but the anger clear through the walls. I lay in bed and let the sound wash over me, not because I enjoyed their distress, but because it reminded me that their actions had consequences. In the days that followed, they swung between icy politeness and heated outbursts. One afternoon, I returned from dropping Andy off at a play date to find the Wi-Fi password changed, locking me out of our network. When I asked Douglas about it, he shrugged and said he needed to protect their privacy, implying I was snooping. I smiled, pulled out my flip phone, and said I didn't need Wi-Fi to make my calls. That moment might have seemed small, but it reminded me that I didn't have to play the game on their terms. I used the lack of internet to my advantage, spending more time outside walking, clearing my head, and less time reading the news about markets and doom. I also stopped doing their laundry. If they considered me unnecessary, they could wash their own clothes. They noticed the missing baskets of folded towels and asked, and I said pleasantly that I was beginning to pack, so they'd need to take over. Lisa's jaw clenched, but she said nothing because she knew she had no moral ground to stand on. Meanwhile, Deborah updated me that the retired buyers had submitted their financing documents and that the timeline looked good. Jonathan filed a motion to expedite the hearing citing my age and the need to close the sale before winter. Courts sometimes accommodate elders in this way. The judge set a hearing for September 25th, just 10 days away, and we prepared our statements. Jonathan coached me on what to say. Stick to facts, don't let emotion lead, and emphasize the financial contributions I had made. He reminded me that courts look favorably on equitable solutions, and that my age and primary occupancy would carry weight. He also noted that courts do not like to leave elderly life tenants without housing, so the judge might ask about my plans. I told him I had already looked at a small one-bedroom rental above the post office downtown with a ramp and a view of the harbor. It was owned by a friend of Mary's, and she was willing to hold it for me until late October. The rent was affordable, especially with the deposit I'd received from the sale, and the idea of having my own space again thrilled me. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed in my best slacks and a cream sweater, and Mary insisted on driving me so I wouldn't have to face them alone. As we parked at the county courthouse, I felt a wave of memories wash over me. The day I got married here, the day I filed the life estate, the day I paid my property taxes year after year. Lisa and Douglas were already inside with their attorney, a man with slicked back hair and a look of perpetual impatience. The courtroom smelled faintly of bleach and old paper, and the judge, a woman in her 60s, sat behind a bench that seemed far away. We took our seats, and the clerk called our case number, the numbers echoing off the wooden walls. Jonathan spoke first, laying out the facts: the life estate, the co-ownership, the offer, my contributions. He emphasized that I had paid for 70% of the mortgage and maintenance, and that Lisa and Douglas had limited means to buy me out. He cited the statute about equitable partition and asked the court to approve the sale and divide the proceeds accordingly. Their attorney argued that forcing the sale would disrupt a young family and that I could wait until I died to transfer my interest. He tried to paint me as spiteful, but the judge's expression didn't change, and I could tell she was listening for substance. When I took the stand, I spoke calmly, my voice carrying without shaking, thanks to years of reading bedtime stories aloud. I described the moment Douglas told me to move out, the contributions I'd made, and my plan to find alternative housing. I said, I am 76 years old. I do not need to be uprooted without reason, but I also refuse to stay where I'm not wanted. The judge asked me if I had a place to go and if I understood that selling might mean I could not return, and I said yes. She then asked Lisa and Douglas if they could match the offer. They whispered to their attorney, and he said, "We cannot." In that moment, I saw a flash of panic in Lisa's eyes, and part of me wanted to reach over and comfort her again, but I stayed still. The judge said she would take the matter under advisement and would issue a ruling within 5 business days and banged the gavel. We all stood, collected our papers, and left the courtroom into the bright hallway where Mary squeezed my hand. Outside, the sky was clear, and the scent of pine carried on the breeze as we walked down the steps. Lisa and Douglas walked ahead, not looking back, and I felt a heavy mix of sadness and relief. 2 days later, a letter arrived from the court, and I sat at the kitchen table with trembling fingers to open it. The judge had ordered the sale, citing the unlikelihood of a physical partition and the fairness of dividing the proceeds. She noted my age and the fact that the co-owners had effectively told me I was no longer needed. Her words were diplomatic but clear. She ordered that I receive 70% of the net proceeds and that Lisa and Douglas split the remaining 30%. She also ordered that they vacate the premises by closing date to allow the buyers to take possession. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and I felt a weight lift. I called Jonathan to confirm next steps, and he congratulated me and told me to start packing in earnest. When I told Lisa and Douglas, they responded with stony silence, then anger, then finally resigned acceptance. Lisa asked if I was happy, and I said I was relieved to have clarity. She muttered something about betrayal, and I gently reminded her that she had said she didn't need me. I was simply honoring her words. Douglas sulked for days, slamming doors and making snide comments about me enjoying my blood money, but the court order stood between us like a shield. I spent the next week packing my belongings into boxes labeled by room, using markers I had bought at a discount store along with bubble wrap. I hired a couple of movers from a local U-Haul rental center to help me move the heavy furniture on closing day. They were young men with tattoos and gentle voices, and they treated my antique dresser with more respect than my own family had shown. Meanwhile, Lisa and Douglas were scrambling to find a rental. The housing market was tight, and their budget limited them to a 2-bedroom apartment across town. I overheard them arguing about school districts and commute times, and part of me felt sorry for them because they had created their own storm. But my sympathy did not extend to changing my mind. Actions have consequences, and this was theirs. On October 15th, we signed the closing documents at the title company, the smell of fresh coffee and new carpet in the air. The buyers were thrilled, shaking my hand and thanking me for taking such good care of the house. Deborah hugged me, whispering, "You did the right thing," and I believed her. The proceeds were wired to my new account, but Karen had warned me that large transfers may be subject to a hold of up to 7 business days. Sure enough, when I checked my account, I saw that only a portion was available immediately, with the rest pending. I didn't panic because I had planned for this. I had enough savings to tide me over until the hold cleared. The first $225 posted the next day, as per regulation, and the remainder cleared within 5 days, just as Karen had explained. I used part of the money to pay the movers and to pay the first month's rent and security deposit on my new apartment. I also treated myself to a brand new slow cooker from Kohl's because my old one had cracked, and cooking for one still deserved warmth. Moving day arrived with clear skies and crisp air, and I hugged Mary goodbye on my porch, tears in both our eyes. "This isn't goodbye," she said. "It's just a different kind of neighbor." Andy ran up, threw his arms around me, and whispered, "Don't forget me." I squeezed him tight and said, "Never, my sweet boy. Call me any time. My number isn't changing." Lisa watched from the doorway, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. Douglas busied himself with his phone, perhaps texting the landlord or complaining about me to a friend. As I drove away in my loaded Camry, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the house shrink behind me, its white siding glowing in the morning sun. I felt a surge of both sadness and liberation, 2 rivers merging into one. At my new apartment, there was a small welcome basket from the landlord with a set of keys, a box of crackers, and a card that read, "Welcome home." The space was smaller but cozy. with a view of the harbor where fishing boats bobbed like sleepily nodding heads. I unpacked my boxes slowly, placing the photo of me and baby Lisa on the mantel, letting it remind me that love and hurt can coexist. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. I joined a silver sneakers class at the local YMCA and found myself laughing more than I had in months as we stretched and chatted. I spent mornings walking along the harbor, the salty wind clearing my head, the gulls crying above like old friends. I bought fresh vegetables at the farmer's market and cooked for myself with care, proving that I deserved the same nourishment I used to pour into others. Andy called me every Thursday evening from Lisa's phone, and we talked about his homework, his friends, and his dreams of becoming a marine biologist. Lisa's voice sometimes hovered in the background, and occasionally she would get on the line and chat with me, tentative but civil. Douglas never called, and I didn't mind. My life felt lighter without his constant criticism. Mary visited often, bringing muffins from a local bakery and gossip from the neighborhood, and we would sit on my balcony watching the sunset. One afternoon, a letter arrived addressed to me from the county clerk's office. It was a notice that the court had recorded the partition order, making it official and unassailable after the appeal period lapsed. I filed it in my new filing cabinet, happy to close that chapter legally as well as emotionally. There were still moments when the smell of cinnamon would make me ache for the old kitchen, but those moments softened over time. Thanksgiving came, and Lisa invited me to their apartment for dinner. I hesitated but decided to go because I did not want to sacrifice my relationship with Andy, and because forgiveness, even partial, is a gift we give ourselves. Their apartment was small but tidy, and Lisa had set the table with the china she had inherited from me, a little crack at the edge of one plate I recognized. Douglas greeted me politely, and we avoided talk of the house, focusing instead on the turkey, which was dry, and the gravy, which was perfect. Andy showed me a diorama he had made for school, complete with tiny plastic whales, and I praised him sincerely. After dinner, Lisa walked me to the door and, in a hushed voice, said, "I know we hurt you. I'm sorry." It wasn't everything I wanted to hear, and it didn't erase what had happened, but it was a start. I squeezed her hand and said, "Apologies mean little without actions to match," and she nodded, tears in her eyes. As I left, I thought about the arc of this story, from being told I was not needed to taking control of my destiny. I thought about the small practical steps, the bank accounts, the court filings, the realtor calls that had built the scaffolding of my revenge. I thought about the emotional arcs, anger, sadness, determination, relief, and how each had taught me something about myself. I realized that even at 76, I could still learn, change, and fight for dignity. In the end, the most satisfying revenge wasn't the sale of the house. It was reclaiming my sense of worth and independence. There was no gloating scene where I laughed as they packed boxes. There was only the quiet sound of a gavel and the steady beat of my own heart. If there's a lesson here for anyone listening, it's this. Don't underestimate the strength of a woman who knows her rights and her worth. Life may hand us unexpected betrayals, but we are not powerless, especially when we educate ourselves and act with calm resolve. If you have been pushed aside by those you love, remember that boundaries are a form of love too, love for yourself. As I sit here now, watching the harbor lights wink on as the sun dips below the horizon, I feel peace. There are still scars, of course, but scars mean wounds have healed, and I will wear mine like badges. My hope is that Lisa will learn from this, that Andy will grow up understanding how not to treat family, and that maybe, just maybe, we will find our way back to each other in a healthier way. Until then, I will sip my coffee, write in my journal, take my walks, and live on my own terms. If you made it this far, I invite you to tell me where you're listening from and what boundaries you've had to set with family. We share these stories not to dwell in pain, but to affirm that dignity is worth fighting for at any age. Justice served cold isn't about cruelty. It's about restoring balance when someone tilts your world unfairly. Sometimes the quietest revenge, a signature on a deed, a court order in your favor, is the most powerful. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. Your support means more than you know. Now I'm going to make myself a cup of tea, curl up with a good book, and enjoy the peace of my own home. What would you have done in my shoes, and how do you define home? I'm truly curious. Before I end this story, there are pieces of my past that matter to understanding how betrayal landed on me like a blow. I married my husband, Charlie, when I was 22, and we bought our first little house near the paper mill where he worked. We didn't have much, but we had pride and calloused hands, and we built our life board by board. It was Charlie who taught me how to patch a roof, how to check the oil in the pickup we drove, and how to negotiate with repairmen without flinching. After Lisa was born, he took a second job to make sure I could stay home with her those early years. I remember cold nights wrapped in blankets because we were saving for insulation, and I remember hot summers when we cooled off with popsicles because we didn't have air conditioning. We didn't complain. We laughed. We sang along to the radio, and we believed our sweat would build something lasting. When Charlie died of a heart attack 15 years ago, I felt the foundation of my world crack. But I didn't fall. I went back to work at the library, I sold our old truck, and I kept the mortgage paid with the help of overtime and frugality. Lisa was in college then, and I made sure she didn't know how tight things were, because mothers shield their children even when their children are grown. I mention this because it explains why the words, "We don't need you anymore," cut so deep. After all those sacrifices, my value was being weighed and found wanting. It also explains why I had no intention of letting those sacrifices go unrecognized, not by the world, and certainly not by my own family. Mary knew my history, and one evening as we drank chamomile tea on her porch, she reminded me of the time I marched down to the county clerk's office to contest a property tax increase. I had stood before the commissioners with spreadsheets and receipts and a calm voice, and I had gotten our taxes reduced. Mary said, "You were always good at standing your ground politely." And I smiled because she was right. We reminisced about our younger days, about potlucks at the Methodist Church, and about the year we formed a neighborhood watch after a rash of break-ins. During that time, we had taken turns patrolling at night, armed with nothing but flashlights and our sense of community. Now, facing a different kind of intrusion, I drew on that same community spirit and connection to find strength. Another friend from church, Anita, called to offer her support, telling me about how her brother had once tried to get their mother declared incompetent to take control of her savings. She said the bank had required a notarized letter from a doctor before freezing any account. citing a policy that protects seniors from financial abuse. I took note because my fear had always been that Douglas might attempt something similar, and I wanted to be prepared. I gathered my documents, including letters from my doctor attesting to my mental competence, and added them to my folder. If Douglas attempted to tell the bank I was unstable, I would have papers to wave under a teller's nose, and banks take written statements seriously. The B story expanded as I delved deeper into protective measures. I met with a representative from AARP at the library during an information session about elder financial safety, and she emphasized the importance of having a trusted contact at your bank. I listed Mary as my trusted contact on my new accounts, giving the bank someone to call if they suspected fraud or duress. That simple act gave me peace of mind because it meant there was a second line of defense should anyone try to manipulate my finances. I also ordered a Ring doorbell camera for my new apartment after reading an article about seniors using them to feel secure without relying on others. Lisa used to tease me about being old school, but here I was embracing new technology to maintain independence. The C story also grew as I reconnected with old friends I hadn't seen in years. Margaret, who had moved to Florida, called after she saw a cryptic post Mary made on social media about standing up for yourself. Margaret told me about how her son had tried to rent out her condo while she was recovering from surgery, and she had to threaten legal action. Hearing these stories reminded me that my situation, while painful, was not unique. There is a pattern of adult children assuming entitlement to their parents' resources. That awareness fueled my desire to share this story, not just to vent, but to warn others. So let's go back into the timeline, into some details that may seem small, but illustrate the undercurrents. There was the afternoon when Lisa accused me of using too much hot water after my shower, tapping the water heater dial as if to shame me. She had just spent $200 on a facial at a spa in a nearby city, but she scolded me for enjoying a moment of warmth. I didn't respond then because I knew saving my words for bigger battles would matter more. There was the time Douglas accidentally locked me out by changing the smart lock code while I was outside clipping hydrangeas. I stood on the porch for 20 minutes until he noticed my knock, and he laughed and said he hadn't realized I was out, but his eyes were cold. After that, I kept a physical key in my pocket at all times because access should never depend on someone's mood. Speaking of locks, I also installed a small latch on my bedroom door after noticing things slightly out of place in my drawers. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply added a layer of protection over my privacy because dignity sometimes comes in the form of a small brass latch. While I'm on the subject of dignity, I'll tell you about the day I treated myself to a haircut at a department store salon. It had been months since I'd done anything just for me, and as the stylist massaged my scalp, I felt tears prick my eyes. She didn't ask why, but she smiled and told me her grandmother had raised her, and we bonded over stories of strong women. Afterwards, I walked through the mall, stopping at a craft store to pick up yarn for a shawl I'd been crocheting. Creating something with my hands reminded me that not everything in life is about taking or losing. Sometimes it's simply about making. At the food court, I treated myself to a soft pretzel and watched teenage girls laugh in their cliques, and I realized time is a circle. These errands may seem mundane, but they were acts of reclaiming my identity outside of mother and grandmother roles. Another act of reclaiming came when I renewed my subscription to a cell phone service for seniors and upgraded my phone to one with larger buttons. It felt empowering to choose technology that served me rather than be intimidated by devices my grandson swiped through effortlessly. On a practical note, I also purchased a small safe from Ace Hardware to store my important documents. I bolted it to the floor of my closet, and the act of drilling into wood, of feeling the vibrations through my hands, reminded me of building days with Charlie. All these details added up to the bigger story of taking back control over my environment. Now let me share a reversal moment from Act 2 that could have derailed everything. About a week after the first showings, Douglas canceled a viewing by telling the prospective buyer the house had plumbing issues. Deborah called me, flustered, because the buyer had gotten cold feet after Douglas said the septic needed replacing, which it did not. I was furious, but took a breath and called the county health inspector for an official inspection. He came out, checked the septic, and issued a report stating it was in good working order, which I attached to the listing. Deborah also began scheduling showings only when Douglas wasn't home, citing the need for a neutral environment. This incident added urgency to my plan, and it opened a loop. If Douglas sabotaged enough showings, would we lose our buyer? Thankfully, our buyers were still on board, but I felt the tension like a live wire. Another reversal came when Lisa's friend, a real estate agent from another city, called me to ask if I'd consider selling to a developer she knew. I asked Deborah and Jonathan about it, and they advised caution. Developers often want to tear down and will lowball you. Still, I agreed to hear the developer's offer out of curiosity and to have negotiating leverage. He offered $425,000, $15,000 less than our current offer, and wanted a longer due diligence period, which would give Lisa and Douglas more time to maneuver. I politely declined, citing the better offer, and he pressed but eventually backed off. That conversation made me realize how easy it would have been for someone less informed to be swayed by big words and false urgency. Information is armor, especially for seniors targeted by people who assume we are naive. I had another close call when my car battery died in the grocery store parking lot just days before the court hearing. It was drizzling, and I stood there with my groceries, feeling a wave of panic because the trunk wouldn't open. I called AAA, and they arrived within 30 minutes, the technician cheerful and efficient. He jump-started my Camry, tested the battery, and recommended I replace it soon to avoid another stall. I thanked him and drove straight to an auto parts store, where I bought a new battery and had it installed, using part of the cash I kept in my purse for emergencies. That day taught me that small physical obstacles can feel enormous when your life is in upheaval, but preparedness matters. During that same week, I also discovered a mistake in one of the utility bills. The electric company had charged us twice for 1 month, and Douglas hadn't noticed because he didn't check the statements. I called their customer service, and after 20 minutes of hold music, a representative apologized and credited our account, saving us $180. It wasn't about the money, it was about competence, and it reminded me why I was often the one who balanced the checkbook. Throughout all this, the emotional stakes remained high, and the open loops kept me hooked in my own story. Would Lisa ever apologize? Would Douglas sabotage the sale? Would Andy resent me later? These questions hummed like background noise. At night, when the house creaked and the radiator hissed, I'd sometimes get up and walk through the dark rooms, touching the door frames and whispering goodbye to each. Each goodbye was a paragraph in a longer letter to myself about letting go. I also filled my time by volunteering at the church thrift shop, sorting donations and chatting with other volunteers. One day I found a gently used hardcover of To Kill a Mockingbird and brought it home, deciding to read it again because the story of justice resonated now more than ever. In a small irony, Douglas accused me of being selfish for selling, but he spent his evenings ordering packages online that arrived daily. Boxes of gadgets and office decor piled up in the foyer, and I had to step around them to get to the coat closet. When I pointed this out, he shrugged and said it was for his future office, as if the court's order were an inconvenience rather than an inevitability. Those boxes became physical manifestations of his denial, and each one fueled my resolve. Lisa, meanwhile, swung between pleading and passive-aggressive comments about how grandparents should support their children unconditionally. I responded by cooking dinner, folding my own clothes, and reminding myself that support doesn't mean sacrificing your self-respect. One evening after she said, "I guess some people only care about money," I calmly listed the times I had loaned them money without expectation of repayment. I noted the $5,000 I lent for their down payment, the $3,000 for the hospital bill when Andy was born, and the countless groceries I'd paid for, receipts still in my folder. She fell silent, and the silence was like a verdict. Receipts can be more than paper. They can be protection, proof against gaslighting. Speaking of receipts, I found an old gift receipt in my wallet for a Mother's Day present Lisa had bought me years ago. She had bought me a cookbook, and the receipt triggered a memory of her teenage self saving up for it. It reminded me that people are not one thing. She is both the girl who saved pennies to buy me a cookbook and the woman who told me to leave. That complexity kept me from demonizing her completely, even as I enforced my boundary. Another open loop resolved itself when I realized Andy wasn't being weaponized as much as I feared. Lisa and Douglas tried to limit my time with him after the confrontation, but Andy himself insisted on visiting me, calling me on their cell phone. Children see through more than we give them credit for, and his love became a quiet rebellion against his parents' manipulation. We would meet in the park, swing side by side, and he would chatter about school while I listened, the sound of his voice soothing. He told me he wanted to be an ocean scientist, and I promised to take him to the aquarium after I settled into my new place. We stuck to that plan, and the first Saturday after I moved, I picked him up and drove to the aquarium in a nearby city, a treat we rarely afforded before. We marveled at the giant tank, watched the sea turtles glide, and ate clam chowder in the cafe. On the drive back, Andy asked, "Nana, are you happy now?" And I said, "I'm at peace." He nodded like a wise old man and returned to looking out the window at the fall leaves blazing red and gold. These are the moments we live for, not the arguments or the courtrooms. Yet those legal and financial details built the scaffolding that allowed these moments to continue. Without the bank hold clearing, without the judge's order, without the partition law, I might have been stuck in a home where I was treated like a burden. This interplay of emotion and practicality is what makes stories like mine both relatable and instructive. If you find yourself in a similar situation, know that there are paths forward that honor your feelings while engaging the systems that protect you. Find a lawyer who listens, a friend who shows up, and a bank teller who knows your name. Document everything, keep your receipts, know the consent laws in your state if you need to record, and don't be afraid to use them. Tell someone you trust what's happening because secrets are fertile ground for abuse. Stand in your kitchen, feel the grain of the wood under your fingertips, and remember whose hands built that home. Then, if necessary, pick up the pen, sign the papers, and take back control of your story. Because there is nothing more satisfying than rewriting a narrative that someone else tried to dictate for you. At this point, you might wonder whether there were quiet moments of doubt during this process. There were, and one struck me late one night when rain hammered against the roof and thunder rattled the windows. I woke, heart pounding, and for a moment thought I had dreamt the confrontation and the court case. But then I saw the packed boxes lining the wall and felt the weight of my decision settle on me. I whispered to the darkness, "Am I doing the right thing?" And the silence answered with the steady drip in the sink. I thought of Charlie, of his calloused hands and his faith in me, and I knew he would have told me to stand firm. In the morning, Mary called and asked if I needed anything from the store because she was heading there, and I smiled at the normalcy of her errand. I asked her to pick up more packing tape and a box of pain relievers for my back, and she dropped them off with a hug. Throughout this journey, small acts of kindness from friends balanced the cruelty from family, reminding me that we build our chosen families too. Another person who supported me was Reverend Thomas from our church, who visited one afternoon and sat with me on the porch. He did not try to counsel me out of my decision. Instead, he listened and offered a prayer for wisdom and peace. He also mentioned that he had seen many older women manipulated by their children into signing over property or bank accounts, and he commended me for standing my ground. Hearing that from a man of faith reinforced that my actions were not selfish but protective. During this time, I also reconnected with my niece Beth, who lives in another state and works as an accountant. She and I had drifted apart after her mother's funeral, but she reached out after hearing from Carol and offered to review my finances. We spent an hour on the phone going over numbers, and she helped me set up a budget that accounted for my new expenses and allowed for a small travel fund. She told me to treat myself now and then, and I smiled at the thought of visiting national parks I had only seen on postcards. Beth also reminded me to review my homeowners and renters insurance, and I called State Farm to update my policies accordingly. The agent was kind and walked me through the coverage differences between owning and renting, and we adjusted my premiums. I mention this because financial housekeeping is part of reclaiming independence. You can't feel free if you're worried about coverage gaps. Speaking of coverage, let me also tell you about my friend Lila, who had a scare with an identity thief last year. Someone had opened a credit card in her name, and she discovered it when a fraud alert pinged her cell phone. She called the hotline, reported the fraud, and they closed the account. But the experience shook her. Lila's story prompted me to check my own credit reports and freeze them temporarily to prevent any unauthorized activity. It is not paranoia to protect yourself. It's prudence, and prudence is a form of respect for your own labor. Back in the realm of day-to-day life, there were also lighter moments that punctuated the tension. One Saturday, Andy and I baked a cake from scratch, using a recipe I found on the back of a butter box. We made a mess of the kitchen, and flour dusted our hair like snow, and for a while everything felt normal. Lisa came in mid-mixing, saw the chaos, and started to scold, but I handed her a spatula and said, "Join us or don't, this is my time with him." To my surprise, she laughed, grabbed a bowl, and the three of us baked and frosted, frosting each other's noses with buttercream. Those moments are why I can't write my daughter off entirely. She is still in there somewhere beneath the fear and greed. Another light moment occurred when Mary and I attended a craft fair at the high school and ended up buying matching hand-knitted scarves. We wandered among the booths, admiring quilts, jams, and handmade candles, and I felt at peace among the hum of community. At one booth, I bought a jar of local honey because the beekeeper reminded me of my father, who loved bees and had kept hives. The smell of beeswax and the taste of honey on warm biscuits is a comfort that cannot be purchased at any store. These sensory memories anchored me when the legal process felt abstract and cold. Let's not forget about the logistics of moving either. I learned more about rental trucks than I ever wanted to know. When I called a moving truck company to compare prices, their customer service rep explained the difference between mileage fees and day rates. I ended up sticking with the local U-Haul because of familiarity, but having options felt empowering. The moving day itself was a study in controlled chaos. Boxes stacked like Jenga towers, labels facing out, and lists taped to the walls. I had printed the lists using the library's printers because my old inkjet had finally died, and the librarian smiled when she saw the stack of labels. She whispered, "Are you moving?" And I whispered back, "Yes, but it's a good thing." And she squeezed my hand. It seemed everyone in town knew, but remained respectfully quiet, which is the mark of a true community. Another brand mention that fits here is that I used a duster cloth to dust the empty shelves before leaving. The convenience of those disposable cloths cannot be overstated. After cleaning, I sat on the bare floor of my empty bedroom, leaning against the wall, and let myself cry for exactly 3 minutes. I timed it because I didn't want to drown in sadness. I wanted to acknowledge it and then move forward. In the final days, small things seemed big. The way the sunlight hit the stairwell in the afternoon, the creak of the third step, the smell of Douglas's cologne lingering in the hallway. I took mental snapshots of each, like closing scenes in a movie, to file away under places I've been. There were also conversations with Lisa where she hinted at regret, but didn't fully step into accountability. "You know, I always thought you'd live with us forever," she said one night, and I replied, "Then you shouldn't have asked me to leave." She sighed, and we sat in silence, the hum of the refrigerator filling the gap, both of us aware that some words cannot be unsaid. When I told her about my new place above the post office, she said, "That sounds nice. Maybe Andy and I can visit," and I said yes. Douglas, for his part, never apologized, but he did begin to pack his things earlier than I expected, perhaps eager to be rid of me. On his last day in the house, he left a spare key on the counter without a word, and that gesture felt like a pale olive branch. After moving, I noticed things about myself that I hadn't had time to see before. For one, I enjoyed the quiet. The absence of slamming doors and heavy footsteps allowed me to hear my own breathing. I rediscovered my love of painting. I bought a set of watercolors and spent evenings watching tutorials, practicing washes and shadows. My first painting was of my old house viewed from memory, bathed in golden afternoon light. My second was of my new view over the harbor. I also started attending a book club at the public library, where we discussed novels and memoirs over homemade cookies and decaf coffee. The women there quickly became friends, and they invited me to join their weekly walking group that meets at the park. On one of those walks, I tripped over a root and laughed instead of crying, grateful for the arms that caught me. They told me about their own stories of family tension, and we shared strategies like we were swapping recipes. I realized that my story had given them permission to speak about things they'd kept quiet, and that was an unexpected gift. At my new apartment, I installed the Ring doorbell and subscribed to a low-cost plan. I set it up on my phone and marveled at the clarity of the video. Technology can feel like a barrier, but when used for autonomy, it becomes a bridge. I also invested in a slow cooker cookbook because I wanted to try new recipes now that I wasn't cooking for picky eaters. I made a white chicken chili using condensed soup, and the smell filled my small kitchen, warming the walls. While it simmered, I wrote in my journal about the smell and how it reminded me of winters when Charlie would come home with cold hands and we would warm up with soup. Writing these details may seem trivial, but they are the fabric of a life being reclaimed. There were also days when I did nothing but listen to the radio and knit, my cats curled up beside me, the world outside humming. I adopted 2 cats from the animal shelter, naming them Hazel and Moxie because I admired those qualities. They brought a different kind of companionship, one that didn't ask or demand, just purred. Andy adored them when he visited, and he insisted on helping me pick out cat food at the pet store, reading the ingredients out loud like a little scientist. In the spring, I planted herbs in pots along my windowsill: basil, thyme, rosemary, and mint. The smell of crushed mint leaves took me back to the afternoon I overheard Lisa planning to evict me, and I smiled at the ironic symmetry. As the months passed, Lisa's phone calls became more relaxed, and she even visited without Douglas one Sunday. We sat on my couch, drank tea from matching mugs, and she spoke about her job stresses and her worries about balancing work and motherhood. She admitted that she had felt trapped in the house, torn between loyalty to me and her husband, and she had lashed out. It wasn't a full apology, but it was a step, and I acknowledged that I also had clung to control, fearing irrelevance. We agreed that families should be honest about needs and boundaries rather than use guilt or obligation. When she left, I hugged her and whispered, "I love you." And she whispered back, "I love you too, Mom." That conversation did not fix everything, but it opened a door that had been shut. Douglas still maintained his distance, and perhaps that is for the best. Some relationships are healthier with space. Andy thrived in his new school, joining the science club and making friends. He would call to tell me about experiments like building volcanoes with baking soda. One day he sent me a video of himself playing soccer, wearing a jersey his parents had bought at a sporting goods store, and I cheered from my couch. I also started volunteering at the community garden, where we grew vegetables for the food pantry. There I met young mothers, immigrants, and retirees, all digging in the earth together, all sharing stories. One woman, Alina, told me about fleeing war and finding solace in soil, and we bonded over our mutual love of beets. These connections reminded me that while family can hurt us, strangers can heal us, and community can fill gaps left by blood. In July, I traveled to visit Beth using my travel fund, and we drove her car to a market she had wanted to see. We stopped at a large travel stop for snacks, and she laughed at how excited I was by the wall of jerky and the clean bathrooms. Traveling at 76 felt like defying expectations, and I relished every mile. Back home, I continued painting and eventually sold 2 of my watercolors at a local craft fair. I priced them modestly, and the woman who bought one said she could feel the love in the strokes. That comment warmed me in a way money couldn't. When my exercise instructor heard about my art, she invited me to teach a class at the senior center, and I did. Standing in front of a dozen women, paintbrush in hand, I felt a surge of confidence. I told them about negative space, about layering colors, and about using art as a way to process feelings, and we laughed when someone splattered paint. These new roles, teacher, artist, volunteer, filled the void left by the role of live-in mother. Of course, not everything was perfect. I caught a nasty cold in January and spent a week under blankets, sipping herbal tea and watching reruns of old sitcoms. But even then, Mary stopped by with homemade chicken soup, and Lisa called to check on me, and I felt cared for. And there were occasional pangs when I'd drive past the old house. Now, with new curtains and a different car in the driveway, I'd feel a twist of nostalgia, then exhale and keep driving because that chapter was closed. In time, Lisa and I found a new equilibrium. She stopped expecting me to babysit on demand, and instead we scheduled visits that respected my time. I began to say no when I needed rest, and she began to understand that boundaries were not rejection, but respect. On Mother's Day, she invited me to brunch at a local diner and handed me a homemade card that said, "Thank you for teaching me strength." Tears sprung up and we held hands across the sticky vinyl table, the smell of bacon in the air. I keep that card pinned on my fridge alongside Andy's drawings as a reminder that relationships can evolve and heal. Now and then I still think about the legal documents, the court, the bank holds, the recordings, and I realize how instrumental each was. Those practical steps were the bones of the plan, but the heart was my determination. If I had simply gotten angry or simply given in, the outcome would have been misery either way. Combining emotion with action, heartbreak with spreadsheets, is what delivered justice. So where are we now in the timeline? We're in a place of calm, reflection, and quiet joy. The harbor outside my window still ebbs and flows with the tide, much like relationships. Sometimes they recede, sometimes they surge, but there is rhythm and predictability once you attune yourself. As summer rounds into fall, I plan to visit a national park, a place I haven't seen since Charlie was alive. I will drive along the coast, stop at a gas station for fuel and a coffee, and take my time. I will bring a sketchbook and capture the rugged beauty of the cliffs and the quiet strength of pine trees that cling to rocks. I will think of all the women who have stood up to their families not out of spite but out of necessity. I will whisper a thank you to them on the wind. And when I come home, I will once again sit with my mug, read your comments, and maybe share another story. Because though this chapter is closed, life is full of new pages waiting to be written. Perhaps there will be fewer courtrooms and more sunrises, fewer ultimatums, and more invitations. Perhaps next time the story will be about forgiveness, or about a garden, or about travel. Or perhaps it will be about you, about how you turned a betrayal into a beginning. Either way, I'm grateful for this space to share, to listen, and to know that even at 76, my voice matters. If you've ever been told you're not needed, hear me now. You are needed, and you have the right to decide how. If someone tries to push you out of your own story, pick up the pen and write the next line yourself. Remember to check your deeds, know your consent laws, open your own bank accounts, and trust your gut. And once in a while, treat yourself to something simple like a bouquet from a grocery store or a new pair of comfortable shoes. Little comforts are acts of kindness to ourselves and tell us we are worth more than our utility to others. As I finish this last cup of tea and watch a seagull float by, I feel proud. Not because I sold a house or because I won a court case, but because I reclaimed my sense of self. That is the revenge, transforming pain into strength, isolation into community, and endings into beginnings. Thank you for listening, for holding space, and for being part of this journey. Please tell me where you're listening from and whether you've had to set boundaries with loved ones. Your stories inspire me, and together we build a community that refuses to be diminished. Until next time, may you find the courage to stand up and the wisdom to know when to let go. I'll leave you with this image, a woman sitting by a window, her hair silver, her gaze steady, her hands steady as she writes her next chapter. Sometimes I still find myself instinctively reaching for the light switch in the hallway at the old height, and then I smile at the muscle memory. Our bodies hold on to places even when our minds have moved on, and each new habit formed is proof of resilience. I also invested in a wireless hotspot device for my car after a storm knocked out power in my building, because contingency plans are practical love. While I don't endorse any particular company, having reliable communication matters when you live alone, especially in winter. I remember one especially blustery evening in December when a nor'easter threatened to cut off access roads. I stocked up on groceries, including extra candles and a box of hot cocoa mix, and settled in. The wind howled, rattling my windows, but I felt safe, knowing I was exactly where I chose to be. During that storm, I spent hours at my kitchen table doing a puzzle of a lighthouse and thinking about guidance through darkness. It struck me how lighthouses don't stop storms. They simply help ships navigate them, and that was what my plan had been, a lighthouse. Another day I visited the local museum and stood for 20 minutes in front of a painting of a mother and daughter cooking. The daughter looked older, the mother younger, time blurred in art, and I thought about how roles reverse and shift. I considered writing a letter to the woman I used to be, telling her not to give up when the first crack in trust appeared. I'd tell her to pay closer attention to the way Douglas corrected her in small ways, to the way Lisa deferred to him. I'd tell her to speak up sooner, to consult a lawyer early, to not assume love alone prevents betrayal. And I'd reassure her that she would come out stronger, even if the path was steep and lonely. A friend of mine once said, "Justice is the slowest form of lightning," and I finally understand that. It's dazzling when it strikes, but you don't see the charge building until it's there, illuminating everything. My charge built through years of small slights, through reading statutes, through saving receipts, through quiet resolve. When the lightning struck, it did not destroy, it clarified. In my new apartment, I have a small chalkboard on the wall where I write quotes that inspire me. One of them says, "Boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously." and I look at it often. Another says, our wounds are often the openings into the best and most beautiful part of us, and I believe it. I have also written, justice served cold tastes like clarity, which makes me smile every morning. These sayings anchor me, much like the smell of coffee or the sound of seagulls outside my window. More practically, I have learned to keep a printed copy of my bank's hold policy in my file, because memory fades, but paper doesn't. I have also started mentoring younger women at church about financial literacy, teaching them to read deeds and credit card agreements. It's my way of turning my experience into a tool for others. When one of them asked if I was angry with my daughter, I said, I was, and sometimes I still am, but anger is not a place to live. I explained that anger can be a compass pointing to where boundaries need strengthening, but it's not the destination. They nodded, and I saw in their eyes the recognition of future decisions they'd have to make. I told them about the one-party consent law in our state, about partition actions, about bank holds, and they took notes, eyes wide. Information is empowerment, and giving it away feels like planting seeds. Another seed I hope to plant is the idea that revenge doesn't have to be vindictive. It can be restorative. It can be a way to restore balance, to remind those who have hurt you that you are not powerless, and it can restore your own faith in yourself. When Lisa and Douglas drove away from the closing, their faces tight, I did not wave, but I did wish them growth. Growth often comes through consequences, and I hope they look back one day and see this as a turning point for them as well. I hope they realize that using a child as leverage is wrong and that respect is not transactional. I hope Andy grows up understanding that love is shown through actions and that he treats his parents and one day his own children with grace. And I hope you, listening to my story, take from it whatever you need: warning, encouragement, solidarity, or simply an hour of feeling seen. Sometimes you have to lose a house to find a home within yourself. I found mine, and I hope you find yours too.